Before Malachi could speak, Elena's sobs turned into a hollow silence. She sat hunched on the porch, her wedding dress torn and heavy with dust, her face hidden in her hands. The desert wind pulled at her hair, tangling the strands like the knots in her past. Malachi had seen men broken by war, by whiskey, by the cruel hand of fate. But the sight of her unraveling like this struck him deeper than any battlefield ever had. He crouched beside her, his boots crunching against the wood. "Elena," he said quietly, the name tasting strange on his tongue after days of calling her Violet. "Look at me." She didn't. Not at first. But when she finally lifted her gaze, he saw the truth swimming in her eyes. Fear, yes, but beneath it, something harder, sharper, the kind of steel forged in fire. "You don't know what he's capable of," she whispered. "Cain doesn't lose. He never loses. He'll strip this land bare, buy out every man in town, poison every ear until they believe I'm a murderer who deserves the rope." Malachi felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. He had no illusions. Cain wasn't just a father with a grudge. He was a man who built empires on other people's ruin. And now his shadow stretched across Malachi's porch. Mrs. Crane stepped out again, her lined face grim, her shotgun cradled in her arms.
"I've seen men like him before,"
she said flatly, "thinking they own everything they touch. But no man owns the truth, child. Not if you've still got the strength to speak it." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "The truth?" Her voice cracked. "The truth is a noose, Mrs. Crane. The truth is my father traded me like cattle and I killed the man who bought me." The words hung heavy in the twilight. Malachi stared at her, but not with judgment. Instead, he saw her shoulders square, as if confessing lifted a burden she had carried too long. She wasn't begging for forgiveness, she was daring the world to condemn her. "Then let them come," Malachi said at last, his voice low, steady. "Let Cain and his dogs ride in here with their lies. They'll find out fast enough this ranch isn't theirs to take." Elena turned to him, something sparking in her eyes, surprise, maybe even gratitude. For the first time since Cain had appeared, she didn't look like prey. She looked like someone ready to fight. But that night, when silence swallowed the ranch, Malachi didn't sleep. He sat by the window with a rifle across his lap, listening to the coyotes call. Every shadow outside looked like a rider waiting. Every gust of wind carried the memory of Cain's words. "She belongs to me. She always has." The next morning, the town was already buzzing. Malachi saddled his horse, intending to fetch supplies before Cain's men could poison the well. Elena hesitated, then pulled a shawl over her hair and mounted up beside him. "Better I ride with you," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. "If they mean to drag me out in chains, I won't let them take me in the dark." Malachi said nothing, but he respected the fire in her voice. She was done hiding. When they reached the main street, the saloon doors creaked open. Marcus stood there, Cain's false sheriff, grinning like a wolf. He tipped his hat mockingly, his voice carrying across the street. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," he drawled. "Folks were just asking me about your new bride, Brooks. I told them the truth, that she's got blood on her hands, that you're sheltering a killer." Heads turned. Whispers spread like sparks through dry brush. The blacksmith frowned. The storekeeper shifted uneasily. The preacher averted his gaze. Malachi felt the weight of their judgment pressing in. He kept his voice calm, but his hand hovered near his gun. "You've got a lot to say for a man with no badge, Marcus. Best watch your tongue before someone cuts it out." Marcus chuckled, but his eyes narrowed. "You think you can stand against Cain? Against the men who ride with him? You're just one rancher with a broken-down house and a shotgun-toting widow. He'll burn you out before he lets her go." Elena's voice cut sharp through the tension. Better to burn than to rot under him. The crowd fell silent at her defiance. Marcus's smirk faltered. For a heartbeat, Malachi thought the man might draw right there in the street. But Marcus only spat in the dust and turned back toward the saloon. "Enjoy your last days, Mrs. Brooks. They'll be short." That night, Malachi found the message scorched into his barn door. She is his. The smell of burned wood lingered like a curse. Elena stared at the words, her lips pressed tight, her fists clenched. "He won't stop," she murmured. "He'll bleed this land dry until there's nothing left but ash." Malachi placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then let him come. I've fought men before. Cain will find out soon enough that not everyone bows." Elena looked at him then, and for the first time there was something like trust in her eyes. The storm was gathering, and both of them knew when it broke, blood would soak the desert sand. The night after the barn was marked, Malachi dreamed of fire. Flames licked the rafters, swallowing the only home he had ever known, while the sound of horses thundered all around him. In the dream, Elena's voice echoed faintly through the smoke, calling his name. But every time he turned, she vanished into the ash. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the rifle still across his knees where he'd fallen asleep in the chair. Outside, the desert was pale with the coming sunrise. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon with the eyes of a man who'd learned long ago that danger never announced itself until it was too late. The words burned into the barn still glowed faintly, as though Cain's threat had seeped into the very grain of the wood. Elena was already awake, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, sitting silent on the steps. The hollows under her eyes told Malachi she hadn't slept either. When she finally looked at him, her gaze was steady, but there was no mistaking the fear behind it. "He'll come soon," she whispered. "Cain doesn't wait long. If he marked the barn, it means he's already set things in motion." Malachi nodded, the truth of her words heavy on him. He'd faced raiders, outlaws, and hired guns in his time. But Cain was different. Cain didn't just kill, he consumed. He turned whole towns into shadows of themselves, men into slaves, women into bargaining chips. By mid-morning, word had spread through town like wildfire. Cain and his men had taken up residence in the hotel, their black horses tied out front like warning beacons. Malachi rode in for supplies, Elena hidden beneath her shawl again, and felt the weight of every stare. Some were pitying, some accusatory, and a few held the hungry gleam of men who already smelled profit in Cain's shadow. The blacksmith leaned against his forge as Malachi passed, spitting into the dust. "Brooks," he muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Best hand her over. Ain't no use dying for a woman who brings trouble like a storm." Malachi reined his horse hard, meeting the man's gaze. "You got a wife, Jacob?" The blacksmith stiffened. "Course I do. Then you know what it means to stand for her, to fight for her, even if the whole damn world says she ain't worth it. Now imagine every man you knew wanted her on a leash, and you were the last thing standing in their way. What would you do?" Jacob's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Malachi nudged his horse on, leaving the silence behind him. Inside the general store, the tension was thicker still. The shopkeeper, Mr. Holt, avoided Malachi's eyes as he filled his order. "Best not to make enemies you can't beat, Brooks," he murmured, sliding the sack of flour across the counter. "Cain's got money, man, Reach. You've got, what? One rifle and a widow with a shotgun?" Malachi didn't answer at first. He let the silence stretch until Holt shifted uncomfortably. Then he leaned close, his voice low. "Sometimes one rifle's enough. Depends on the man holding it." As they left the store, Elena's hand brushed against his. He glanced at her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he saw the faintest trace of a smile ghost her lips. Not joy, just a flicker of recognition that she wasn't alone anymore. That evening, Mrs. Crane served supper in silence, her eyes sharp as a hawk's as she watched Elena push food around her plate. Finally, the older woman spoke. "You can't keep running, child," she said firmly. "Men like Cain, they feed on fear. Only way to beat him is to take his power from him. And power ain't in his fists nor in his guns. It's in the way he makes you believe you got no choice." Elena's fork clattered against the plate. "You don't understand. He owns everything. Money, men, law. Even if Malachi stands with me, Cain will find a way to grind us down until we've got nothing left." Mrs. Crane leaned forward, her voice as sharp as the edge of her knife. "Then you make him bleed for every inch he takes. You make him pay so high a price he thinks twice before ever touching you again." Malachi said nothing, but the fire in Mrs. Crane's words stirred something inside him. Maybe Cain had power. Maybe he owned half the men in this county. But the land beneath Malachi's boots was his, bought with sweat and blood, defended more than once against men who thought they could take it. Cain wasn't the first vulture to circle his home, but he might be the last if Malachi failed. By the third day, Cain began tightening the noose. His riders lingered at the edge of Malachi's land, watching, waiting. Fences were cut, cattle driven off, wells poisoned with dead vermin. Each act was small enough to avoid open war, but together they painted the message clear: surrender, Elena, or lose everything. Elena sat by the window at night, staring out into the dark. "He's wearing you down," she said softly. "That's what he does. He'll take piece after piece until there's nothing left to fight for. And then he'll come for me." Malachi placed a hand over hers. "Not while I'm still breathing." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Then you'll die, Malachi, and I'll lose the only good man who ever stood between me and the dark." The words cut deep, sharper than any blade. But Malachi didn't flinch. He had already made his choice the night Cain rode onto his land. There was no turning back. The turning point came on the fourth day. A rider approached at dusk, not with Cain's men, but alone, carrying a white cloth tied to his saddle horn. Malachi and Mrs. Crane watched warily as he dismounted at the fence line. The man was Apache, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes calm but unyielding. He spoke slowly, in careful English. "You fed one of ours once, a woman lost, hungry. She told us of your kindness. Now we see you are hunted. We do not fight your battles, but sometimes battles choose us." Malachi's throat tightened. He remembered the night months ago when a half-starved woman had stumbled onto his land, her child clinging to her side. He'd given them food, water, and a place to rest before they vanished into the desert. He hadn't thought of it since. Now that act of mercy had returned, not as a memory, but as a shield. The Apache elder nodded once, then turned his horse toward the horizon. And as the sun dipped below the desert hills, Malachi saw them, shapes rising from the sands, silent riders stretching across the horizon, their numbers swelling with every heartbeat. 500 riders, arrayed like an unspoken promise. Elena stepped onto the porch, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as she gasped. For the first time, hope flickered in her eyes. Not safety, not yet, but the knowledge that Cain would not find them alone. Malachi tightened his grip on his rifle, his voice steady. "Looks like the fight won't be ours alone after all." And as the stars bloomed above the desert sky, Malachi realized that Cain's shadow had met its match. The desert held its breath. A storm gathered in silence, not of wind or rain, but of men, rage, and blood yet to be spilled. Malachi Brooks had chosen his side, though he knew the price would not just be his ranch, it would be his soul. Cain Blackwood was no ordinary man to defy. He was law without justice, judgment without truth, and blood without kinship. To stand against him was to dig one's own grave. Yet Malachi's boots had already stepped into the dust, and there was no turning back. The night was restless. Coyotes cried, somewhere beyond the hills, their haunting song carried on the wind. Inside the cabin, Elena sat at the wooden table, her face pale against the lantern glow. She held Sarah's hand, trembling, as though the child were the only anchor tethering her to the world. Malachi stood at the door, rifle leaning against the frame, eyes fixed on the horizon where darkness and dawn would soon collide. He could feel Cain's presence before he saw it. A man like that carried an army not just in his wake, but in his shadow. By sunrise, the dust rose, wagon wheels grinding, horse hooves pounding, iron clashing against leather. Cain had come with more than enforcers. He had brought allies, mercenaries, ranch hands loyal to his coin, drifters who would spill blood for whiskey. And at his side, the preacher Maddox, the man who had twisted God's words into shackles. Malachi's grip on the rifle tightened. For the first time in years, he felt fear not for his life, but for Elena's, and for the choice he'd made that bound him to a war he could not win. The first shots weren't fired by Cain. They were fired by his men, hot lead tearing through the stillness, shattering windows and wood. The cabin groaned under the violence. Malachi pulled Elena and Sarah to the ground as splinters rained around them. The girl screamed, but Elena pressed her face into her chest, whispering promises she could not keep. "Stay low," Malachi barked, loading his rifle. "If they come through that door, they'll meet hell before they meet you." He fired through the window. One rider fell, his scream cut short in the dust. Another scrambled back, horse-rearing. Malachi moved with the precision of a man who'd lived his life in gunsmoke and silence. Yet for every enemy that fell, 2 more took their place. Cain's voice soon rose over the chaos, calm and cold. "Elena, daughter," he called, his tone twisted with false tenderness. "Come now, and this will end. That man cannot save you. He cannot even save himself." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but not of fear. They were tears of rage, the kind only betrayal could carve into a soul. She clutched Sarah tighter. "He's not my father," she whispered, though the words cracked under the weight of her blood. "He's the reason my life is a lie. He's the reason everything I loved was stolen." Cain laughed, the sound slicing through the smoke. "Do you think that drifter will die for you? He'll hand you over once he tires of your shame. Men like him always do." But Cain did not know Malachi Brooks, and he did not know the line he had crossed. The standoff stretched, bullets answering bullets, until the cabin's defenses began to fail. The walls bled holes, the door shook, hinges screaming. Malachi knew they couldn't hold. With a quick glance, he saw Elena's fear mirrored in her eyes, yet beneath it, something else. A spark, a will to fight. "Elena," he said, crouching close, his breath ragged. "This ends tonight. Not by running, not by surrendering, but by making them bleed for every lie they've chained you with. Can you do that?" Her hand trembled as it reached for the revolver, lying abandoned on the floor. She nodded, lips pressed tight. The next assault broke the door wide. Men poured in like wolves, eyes hungry for blood. Malachi's rifle roared first, dropping one before he reached the threshold. Elena's revolver followed, her shot wild but desperate, grazing another. Sarah screamed, darting beneath the table. The air turned to thunder and smoke. Cain himself stepped into the doorway, framed by firelight, his black coat billowing like a shadow of the devil himself. His revolver gleamed, steady in his hand. His eyes found Malachi, and his lips curled into a smile devoid of mercy. "You should have stayed silent, Brooks," he drawled. "Now you'll be buried with her lies." Malachi raised his rifle, but Cain was faster. A shot rang, burning through Malachi's side. Pain exploded, knocking him to the floor. Elena cried out, firing again, but Cain advanced, unshaken, boots heavy on the blood-soaked boards. Elena moved between him and Malachi, revolver raised, though her hand shook violently. Cain looked at her, and for the first time his voice softened. "Child, you are mine. Do not dishonor yourself with this rebellion. Drop the gun. Come home." Her finger tightened on the trigger, eyes blazing. "Home died the day you forced me into another man's arms." The shot tore the silence. Cain staggered, clutching his chest, his eyes, wide with shock, fixed on her as though he had never believed she could pull the trigger. He tried to speak, but blood filled his throat. With the final step, he collapsed, dust rising around him. The battle did not end with his fall. His men fought on, but their leader's death cracked their will. Some fled into the desert, others dropped their weapons. The preacher Maddox fled like a rat, vanishing into the chaos, his voice swallowed by the night. When the dust cleared, the cabin was a ruin. Malachi lay bleeding, Elena kneeling beside him, Sarah clutching his other hand. His vision blurred, but he saw her face not broken, but fierce, alive, free. For the first time, she was no longer a victim, no longer a pawn. She had chosen her own fate. Dawn broke slowly, washing the horizon in gold. And with it came a sound, the distant rumble of hooves, the groan of wagon wheels. Elena turned, eyes wide. Across the horizon stretched a caravan, 20 wagons deep, riders flanking in silence. Her people had come not in chains, not in fear, but in strength. The tribe had not abandoned her. They had waited, watching, And when the time came, they arrived with gifts, not just food and aid, but allegiance. They had seen her defiance, her strength, and now they answered it. Malachi, weak but alive, watched the riders descend. The land that had always felt empty now thundered with promise. Perhaps he had not lost everything. Perhaps he had gained something greater, a bond forged not by blood, but by sacrifice. The tribe's elder dismounted, his weathered hand resting on Elena's shoulder. His eyes met Malachi's, and though no words were spoken, the vow was clear. Her fight was their fight now. His ranch would not fall. His stand had been seen. And in that moment, the loner, who had once wanted only silence and solitude, found himself bound to something larger: justice, truth, and a family born, not of kinship, but of courage. This is the story of how one rancher's choice to defy power and feed the lost became the spark that lit the horizon. And now I'll leave you with this. In your own life, when silence is easier, when surrender is safer, will you have the courage to stand? Will you bleed for truth, even when the world tells you to bow? Remember, evil wins only when good men and women do nothing. So stand, speak, defend. Because sometimes one choice is enough to change everything. So I ask you, when the hour comes, when shadows close in and silence becomes complicity, what will you do? Will you turn your head, pretending not to see, or will you take the shot that matters? 'Cause courage isn't born in comfort. It's born in the dust, in the blood, in the moments when your voice shakes but you speak anyway, when your hands tremble but you act anyway. Malachi wasn't a hero when the night began. He was a man alone, a man tired of fighting ghosts. But when the choice was laid before him to stand for truth or surrender to lies, he chose to bleed for something greater than himself. And that choice carried the weight of dawn itself. Each of us has that moment. Maybe it won't come with bullets and blood, but it will come in a lie whispered by power, in an injustice brushed aside, in a silence that demands to be broken. When it comes, will you cower or will you rise? Remember this: one voice, one act, one refusal to bow can call an army to your side. Just as Elena's defiance brought riders across the horizon, your courage can awaken others. The world does not change because of the mighty. It changes because ordinary souls decide they will no longer be silent. So carry this story with you. Let it burn in your chest. Stand where others fall. Speak where others whisper. Fight where others run. Because in the end, the legacy of your life will not be written in the moments of safety, it will be written in the battles you chose to face. And when that dawn breaks, when your horizon fills, make sure the world knows this. You did not bow, you stood.